On January 31st, 1968, Lieutenant Fred Abrams was abruptly awakened at 3 a.m. by the deafening sound of mortar shells bursting all around him. Abrams' training kicked in. In just a few minutes, he was on his way to the bunker, carrying his flight suit, boots, and gun belt. Screams, gunshots, and wailing alarms engulfed the air. Abrams recalled, quote, "The attackers got to within 100 yards of our squadron." Hoa Air Base, America's largest airfield in Vietnam, was under assault. If the Viet Cong seized it and destroyed its 500 aircraft, U.S. troops throughout Vietnam would lose their crucial air support against the coordinated Tet Offensive. Abrams and the other F-100 pilots frantically cleared rubble from the runways, while a vastly outnumbered force, fewer than 500 American soldiers and security officers, battled waves of thousands of encircling Viet Cong fighters. If they failed to reopen the runway, the entire airbase would fall. Abrams looked around. The enemy was inside the perimeter. There were no clear battle lines. He had to somehow get airborne, and he had to somehow lay down a deadly line of destruction with a surgical precision never done before. He was going to bomb his own base. Condition red. Howard Yates had always wanted to be a cop. Once drafted into Vietnam as a mechanic, he tried everything in his power to join the Sky Cops, the security force charged with protecting the massive Hoa Air Base, America's largest airfield in Vietnam. He was turned away every time for not being tall enough, but he kept pushing. Finally, they gave him a chance as a police augmentee, a kind of reserve. He was thrilled. No more all-day refueling sessions getting covered in grease. Now he had an M16 and a sliver of authority. It only took Yates a couple of days to regret his decision. On the night of January 30th, 1964, he and a few other security officers were heading back from the town of Bien Hoa. As soon as they approached the security point, the sentry asked, quote, "Hey, aren't you guys augmentees?" Yates, excited to be recognized, confirmed their identity with a childish grin. The sentry's face darkened. He snapped, quote, "Well, you better get your gear and report to the SP Armory ASAP." A jolt of worry shot through Yates. He asked what was happening, but the sentry just pointed at the security placard above the door. It was red. A chill spread through Yates. He knew condition red meant one thing: an attack was imminent. As a freshly minted security officer, it was now his responsibility to help protect the most critical American base in Vietnam. Trying to keep calm, Yates and his fellow augmentees clung to the idea this might be a drill. Lieutenant Colonel Kent Miller, commander of the 3rd Security Police Squadron, walked hastily into the briefing room. He began by pointing to an aerial infrared photo map that had just been rolled out and made particular reference to the area shaded in red. Quote, "That big red blob you see to the east of Hoa Air Base is what military intelligence believes to be a battalion-sized concentration of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers." When Yates heard the word battalion, he had no idea of what that meant in terms of numbers. He was an Air Force man, and he knew about squadrons, not battalions. But having seen most of John Wayne's war movies, he figured that a battalion was more people than anyone wanted to try to get on base uninvited. As augmentees, their assignment was simple: deliver sandwiches and coffee to the men on the perimeter. They rumbled north along Perimeter Road, passing about 8 to 10 augmentees dug in just south of the Army's military police checkpoint. They shouted some earthy salutations to ease the tension and continued on. Even though the MPs were Army, they did the Air Force thing and offered the group some coffee. Satisfied, the MPs waved them on. They circled around to the west side of the checkpoint, where Simmons parked the truck. He suggested that everyone grab a bite from their box lunches while they had the chance. One member of the group ate his sandwich, sipped his coffee, and saved his apple for later. He lit a C-Rat cigarette, pushing his helmet back on his head. Almost immediately, he heard a crackling and a whooshing sound streak overhead. His cigarette dropped to the floor. His first thought was, quote, "What the hell was that?" Seconds later, he got his answer. A 122mm rocket slammed into Bien Hoa Air Base with a gut-churning explosion, spewing a brilliant orange and red mushroom cloud. From where they stood, it looked like their own squadron area. The 12th Air Commandos had been annihilated. This was no drill. The VC had really come to attack Bien Hoa Air Base, and Yates would now have to fight to stop them. plan. Attacking the command center of U.S. air operations in Vietnam, a base fortified inside and out, should have been impossible. But the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army knew exactly what they were doing. Hoa Air Base was the beating heart of American air power in Vietnam, home to over 500 U.S. and South Vietnamese aircraft. Just miles away, Long Binh Post was the nerve center of U.S. Army logistics, housing the 2nd Field Force, the 199th Light Infantry Brigade, and the 12th Aviation Group. Over 20,000 American personnel who kept the war machine running. If North Vietnam was to have any chance of victory, these installations had to be neutralized. The timing was critical. As North Vietnamese forces prepared for the Tet Offensive, a massive coordinated assault on more than 100 South Vietnamese targets, they faced one undeniable obstacle: American air supremacy. The U.S. could put entire battalions to the torch in seconds with napalm and airstrikes. Numbers alone would mean nothing if American jets took to the skies. The solution was to strike first and strike hard. A lightning-fast surprise raid on Bien Hoa. Thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters would emerge from the jungle, sweep through the rubber plantations, and overrun the airbase before American pilots could even reach their cockpits. Destroy the runways, storm the base. With Bien Hoa in flames, U.S. air support across the entire region would be crippled. Victory would follow. But there was a fatal flaw in the plan. As Colonel Kent Miller had explained that night to his security team, the 199th Infantry Brigade had seen it coming. Weeks before, intelligence reports hinted at an imminent assault on Long Binh. Ground radar picked up unusual movement. Just hours before the attack, U.S. aerial surveillance confirmed everything. Thousands of enemy troops shifting through the jungle, closing in. The raid would not be a surprise. The Americans had just minutes, but they knew what was coming. Race to the runway. At 3 a.m. on January 31st, 1964, Lieutenant Fred Abrams of the 531st Tactical Fighter Squadron was yanked from sleep by the thunderous crash of mortar shells. The attack had been anticipated. Abrams had drilled for this exact moment. He recalled, quote, "As a result of having practiced it before, I made very good time from sleeping in bed to inside the bunker, carrying my flight suit, boots, and gun belt." It was a race, one the Americans couldn't afford to lose. The pilots had to reach their aircraft before the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops overran the base. The enemy moved fast, faster than expected. Thousands of them were already inside the perimeter, closing in. Abrams remembers, quote, "The attackers got to within 100 yards of our squadron before being pushed back by the security police with M16s and large machine guns." The enemy was everywhere. Mortars pounded Bien Hoa, tearing through buildings and gouging the runway. Abrams kept running until the order came: no takeoffs. Abrams recalls, quote, "The VC were holed up at the end of the runway and had machine guns and grenades." A nightmare scenario. No aircraft could lift off with machine guns waiting at the tarmac's edge. The Army's 145th Aviation Battalion scrambled gunships, Bell UH-1 Iroquois and AH-1 Cobras, straight into the fight. Abrams watched as, quote, "They fired their rockets into the field off the end of the runway. They didn't even refuel. They just reload because they were right where the fight was." When Abrams finally reached the runway, the blood drained from his face. The enemy had torched an F-4 at the west end, leaving the tarmac littered with burning wreckage and jagged debris. They were stuck on the ground. One loose fragment sucked into an engine, and the F-100s would be torn apart before ever leaving the ground. While helicopter gunships strafed enemy positions, the pilots worked frantically to clear the runway. Captain Robert Hopkins recalled the scene, quote, "The arming area, right off the runway, had a shack on it that the arming people could go into to get out of the sun, and that thing got blown to pieces." As pilots cleared the wreckage, security forces fought to keep the enemy from pushing further inside. Shadows in the bush. Colonel Kent Miller faced disaster. He had just 500 security personnel, including augmentees, to hold off a wave of enemy troops. And the Viet Cong weren't just probing the base, they were here to take it. Miller's gut told him they were outnumbered 5-1. That afternoon, the 7th Air Force had placed his security squadron on maximum alert. No explanation. Even Miller assumed it was another false lead, just like the many before it. The weeks had been riddled with bad intelligence. After so many false alarms, the men inside the base stopped believing an attack would come. Beyond the perimeter, security was the Army's job. Miller had orders: keep his men inside the wire. But as the night spiraled into chaos, one thing became clear: the Army had been caught off guard. At the perimeter, Howard Yates was suddenly surrounded by the full force of the attack. Someone screamed, quote, "Get out." There was no thinking, only instinct. He dove into a roadside ditch just as another rocket slammed into the ground. For a split second, it felt like the earth had swallowed him whole. His bones rattled from the shockwave. The shelling continued for what felt like forever. Then, suddenly, silence. The calm didn't last. Defense Control ordered Yates's unit, Defense 6, to resupply Bunker Hill 10 and an old French military structure, now a key American stronghold. But sniper fire from outside the perimeter kept them pinned down. Staff Sergeant Pete Piazza, overseeing the resupply teams, arrived from the west and flared in tow. He sent his 3 augmentees to find another route to Bunker Hill 10. Not long after they left, static crackled over the radio. Security Police canine handler Airman Bob Press was calling in. His dog, Diablo, was locked onto something at the fence line. Press requested permission to fire a flare. The voice on the radio responded, quote, "Permission granted." The night exploded into a scene ripped from a horror film. The flare rocketed into the sky. Pop, igniting a blinding glow. For a moment, it turned the darkness into day. And then they saw them. Hundreds of shadows shifting in the bush. Gunfire rang out. The canine unit had spotted a concealed Viet Cong force. Seconds later, the pop whoosh of igniting trip flares flashed along the perimeter. Simmons yelled, quote, "Trip flares. They're coming across the wire." Yates muttered to himself, quote, "This is not going to be a good night." Suddenly, small arms of machine gun fire erupted across the eastern perimeter. Simmons led the team down a slope toward a knoll 15 to 20 yards from their truck. They ran, crouched, and crawled through scorched elephant grass. The Air Force routinely burned it to deny the enemy cover. Now, the ash clung to their skin, coating their faces and filling their lungs. At least it worked as camouflage. The Viet Cong pushed westward, past Yates' position, straight into the relentless gunfire from security positions, including Bunker Hill 10. The battle raged. An estimated 1,600 to 2,000 enemy troops, 2 full VC battalions with reinforcements, had breached the wire. They weren't stopping. They were heading straight for the runways and hangars. Miller later described in his report how close they came, quote, 50 to 60 yards from the F-100 aircraft revetments. But they were stopped cold by sentry dog teams, machine gun bunkers, jeep-mounted gun teams, and his security squadron's quick reaction forces. Light of dawn. Back on the runway, Abrams and the other pilots were still trapped. Viet Cong snipers had seized a nearby water tower, making any attempt to take off even more dangerous. Dawn was creeping in. If the security teams and pilots could hold out just a little longer, daylight would turn the tide in their favor. But for now, darkness still ruled the battlefield. Yates crouched behind the knoll, M16 at the ready. The full weight of the moment hit him. He might not make it home. He made his peace with the Almighty, asking for courage and for his loved ones to be protected. Dark shapes moved near the aircraft run-up pad, but the visibility was too poor to tell friend from foe. They held their fire. Meanwhile, Bunker Hill 10, soon to be known as the Little Alamo, was under brutal siege. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into its defenses, but the men inside never stopped firing back. Yates thought those poor guys were taking a pounding. He hoped they could hold on. Then a low drone filled the sky, a sound both eerie and reassuring. Puff the Magic Dragon, an old World War II-era C-47 gunship, rumbled overhead. Its 7.62mm Gatling guns could rip through entire sections of jungle. Parachute flares dropped from the aircraft, turning night into an unnatural, flickering daylight. Suddenly, figures staggered out of the darkness, arms raised. 3 of Yates' team opened fire. The bullets sparked and deflected. Simmons didn't even flinch, quote, grave markers. They had unknowingly taken a position at the edge of an old French cemetery. Yates exhaled, half laughing, embarrassed, mostly relieved. The battle raged on. Then came more bad news over the radio. Tan Son Nhut Air Base was under attack. So was every other major U.S. installation in South Vietnam. By dawn, the familiar whoop, whoop, whoop of Hueys and Cobra gunships filled the air. A Huey gunship made repeated strafing runs near the aircraft run-up pad. On its third pass, it came too close. Larry grabbed the radio and yelled to defense control, quote, "We are in an unmarked position near the old graveyard, and the gunship is firing almost on top of us." The response was anything but reassuring, quote, "We don't have direct communications with the Army choppers. Just try to let them know you're friendlies." Frustrated, Larry waved frantically before flipping the chopper the bird. The door gunner spotted him, held up his own middle finger in return, and then redirected fire elsewhere. Message received. The chopper counteroffensive was relentless. Fires erupted in the jungle, flushing out North Vietnamese troops and breaking their formations. But the fighting wasn't over. The enemy, though scattered, kept attacking in waves. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces were now engaged in brutal close-range combat near the end of the runways. With the enemy positions finally weakened, the pilots could clear the runways. Abrams and another experienced F-100 pilot climbed into their aircraft. They were needed in the sky. I have only been scared once. At 4:45 p.m., Lieutenant Fred Abrams and Major Joe Bulger climbed into their F-100 Super Sabres, their orders clear. Launch a precision strike against the entrenched enemy forces near the runways of Hoa Air Base. For hours, AH-1 Cobra helicopters had strafed and rocketed enemy positions, preventing them from overrunning the flight line. Without those gunships, the enemy would have already reached the parked aircraft, a disaster that would have handed North Vietnam a decisive victory. But even as the Cobras tore into their ranks, the attackers refused to break. They were determined to see the base burn. U.S. commanders had delayed ordering an airstrike as long as possible. In a letter home, Abrams later described the immense pressure of the moment, quote, "They were very hesitant about an airstrike because the troops were so close to the target, and there was absolutely no margin for error." Down below, Yates and the other security forces were still locked in the fight, barely a stone's throw from the enemy. The front lines weren't lines at all, just a chaotic swirl of gunfire, explosions, and shifting positions. They were so close that an errant bomb or miscalculated pass could wipe them out. But command had no choice. Another nightfall could tip the battle in the enemy's favor. The order came. Friendly forces were to mark their positions with colored smoke. The ground team scrambled, hurling canisters that billowed red, green, and yellow plumes into the air. Even so, from thousands of feet above, with bullets streaking through the sky and fires already raging, it was nearly impossible to make out. Abrams and Bulger banked their aircraft, lining up for the first attack run. The radio crackled with final confirmation. Engage. Both pilots nosed down, their F-100 screaming toward the battlefield. The moment of truth. Abrams flipped the switches, aligning the reticle over the seething mass of enemy troops. At over 500 miles per hour, he had to be perfect. Their first payload roared free. Napalm. The tanks tumbled through the air before igniting on impact, consuming everything in a wave of fire. Abrams pulled up hard, his aircraft rattling as he climbed away from the inferno below. Bulger followed seconds later, releasing his own canisters. The jungle burned. But they weren't done. Enemy tracers lanced through the sky, reaching for them. The anti-aircraft fire wasn't organized, but it was relentless. Abrams' heart pounded, not from fear of the enemy fire, but of something far worse. He recalled, quote, "Since I've been here, I've only been scared once, and that was when I was napalming this afternoon. Not because of the VC shooting at me, but afraid I might miss by a few feet." Through the thick smoke, an O-1 Bird Dog spotter plane circled, relaying coordinates for their second run. Abrams and Bulger realigned for a new pass, this time with 500-pound bombs. The Super Sabres thundered in once again, bomb bay doors opening. Bombs away. Each explosive found its mark. The enemy's defensive formation shattered as shockwaves ripped through their positions. The final pass brought another payload of high explosives, obliterating a cluster of bunkers. Then, as Abrams pulled away from his last strike, he saw it, an enormous secondary detonation. One of the enemy's hidden munition caches had gone up, sending debris, dirt, and fire skyward. Whatever they'd been planning to use against the airfield was gone. On the ground, the effect was immediate. The surviving enemy forces, now leaderless and decimated, broke ranks. Those who could still run retreated into the jungle. The siege was over. For nearly 15 hours, Bien Hoa had been under relentless attack. Now, the battlefield was silent. Back at the base, Abrams and Bulger touched down to cheers from the ground crews. For once, the men who maintained the planes, who fueled them and armed them, didn't just see the aircraft leave and return riddled with bullet holes. They had witnessed firsthand what their work had accomplished. The sense of victory was real, but the cost of the battle was still settling in. But for Abrams and Bulger, there was a moment of disbelief. Quote, "We actually did it." Fearless Abrams. Around the perimeter, the fighting dragged on. The enemy had been beaten back, but they weren't gone. Isolated pockets of resistance and scattered snipers held their positions, forcing security police, augmentees, and a handful of army troops to begin sweeping operations. Ammunition was running low. Nerves were raw. Every shadow, every movement was taken as a threat. Then, a gunshot. The security police NCO staggered, clutching his chest. Before his body hit the ground, his team returned fire, the rapid bursts of M16 shredding the shooter before he could fire another round. The echoes of gunfire faded, but the tension only deepened. At a drainage ditch, Yates followed a hardened army soldier, his every step deliberate, every movement razor-sharp from experience. Without warning, the soldier emptied half a magazine into some fallen Viet Cong soldiers before spitting tobacco onto the dirt. Quote, "I thought I saw one move." Yates swallowed hard. Then, finally, the call came. Stand down. The men exhaled, shoulders sagging with exhaustion. An officer dismissed them, urging them to eat and rest, because there was no guarantee the battle was truly over. Tomorrow could bring another attack. On the way to the chow hall, a colonel intercepted them. He didn't say much, just a crisp salute and a simple thank you that meant more than any speech ever could. The mess hall cook grumbled at first, irritated at the sudden rush of men. But when he realized they had spent the night on the perimeter, holding the line, his attitude changed. They were served a proper meal, hot and heavy, the best breakfast Yates had ever tasted. After a long, scalding shower, Yates collapsed into his bunk, muscles aching, mind fogged with exhaustion. He thought, quote, "Finally I can get some shut-eye." His cigarette no longer seemed worth the trouble. Meanwhile, Abrams and Bulger were being honored for their actions in the air that day. Both received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Abrams' citation praised his, quote, "determination, aggressiveness, and courage in executing a flawless airstrike despite extremely poor visibility and the ever-closing grip of darkness." From that day forward, he would carry a new name, Fearless Abrams. The battle was over. The attack on Bien Hoa had been a disaster for the North Vietnamese. The enemy had thrown everything they had at the airbase and lost. The rest of the Tet Offensive would reach a similar end. With Viet Hoa Base in full operational order, American air support across the entire South Vietnamese territory was constant and efficient, helping U.S. troops thwart any attempts to overwhelm U.S. bases and South Vietnamese cities and villages.